I've lived out here in Washington for over a decade, right up against the National Forest. It's quiet, peaceful, and most of the time, the only things I have to worry about are deer getting into my garden or coyotes sniffing around my property. But if you've heard my previous story, you know I've seen things out in those woods that I still can't explain. That night changed the way I look at this place, and while I haven't seen it at my house again, I don't think that means it is done with me. This happened in late spring, just after the last frost had passed, and the forest was coming alive again. The early rains had given way to warm, damp afternoons, and it was the perfect time for morel hunting. I've been picking morel mushrooms for years. There's nothing quite like the taste. And when you know where to look, you can gather enough in a few hours to last for months. If you ever purchase these delicacies, then you know how expensive they are and why it's worth it to make the effort to find them. That morning, I set out with my usual gear: a canvas bag, a walking stick, and a good knife. I kept a sidearm holstered at my hip, not something I always carried, but after what I saw that night, I felt more comfortable being armed. The place I was headed to was about 2 miles in, deep enough that few people ever ventured there, but I knew the area well. The hike was uneventful, the forest alive with birdsong and the occasional rustle of small animals darting through the underbrush. Everything felt normal. For the first hour, I had good luck. I found a few patches, took my time picking, and enjoyed the solitude. It wasn't until I was a little over a mile in that something felt off. I didn't notice it right away, but there was a subtle change in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that made me pause. The birds had gone silent. The background hum of insects had faded. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I stood there for a moment, listening. At first I heard nothing but the breeze through the trees. Then, just barely audible, I picked up on something else. A rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. Slow, deep inhales followed by long, measured exhales. It was close enough for me to hear it clearly. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just dense forest stretching in every direction. I told myself it was my imagination, that maybe I was just on edge. But as I took a step forward, the breathing stopped. Abruptly, like whatever was making it had just realized I was listening. That's when I noticed the footprints. These prints were larger, deeper, and fresher than my own, not to mention they clearly weren't made by shoes. They hadn't been there when I passed through the first time. Something had been following me. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to panic, but my instincts were screaming at me to leave. I tightened my grip on my walking stick, scanning the trees again. Still nothing, but I could feel it, that unsettling, prickling sensation of being watched. I started walking back the way I came, trying to keep my pace steady. Running wouldn't do me any good. Whatever was out there had the advantage in these woods. My boots crunched against the damp earth, every sound amplified by the eerie silence. Then, just as I rounded a bend in the trail, I heard it. A branch snapped. Not just a small twig, something heavy and big. I stopped, heart hammering in my chest. I turned my head slightly, catching a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Something dark, shifting between the trees. It was big, bigger than any person should be. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the grip of my sidearm. I didn't want to draw it unless I had to, but I wasn't about to take chances. The figure moved again, stepping behind a thicker cluster of trees just far enough that I couldn't get a clear look. I could feel my pulse in my ears. My throat suddenly became drier than it had ever been. Then it made a sound, a low, guttural, clicking noise, followed by a deep, resonant exhale. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I'd ever heard before either. It was purposeful, deliberate, like it was testing my reaction. I took a slow step backward, then another. The figure didn't move, didn't make another sound. It was just watching. I knew if I turned my back on it, I'd regret it, so I kept my eyes on that spot, moving as carefully as I could. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it went. The figure shifted again, blending into the trees, and in a blink, it was gone. I didn't stick around to find out where it went. I moved as fast as I could without outright running, keeping my ears trained on the forest behind me. By the time I reached the edge of my property, the sounds had faded, but that feeling, the one of being watched, never really left. That night, as I sat on my porch, staring out at the darkened tree line, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was out there, it knew me now. And I had the sinking feeling that this wouldn't be the last time I saw it. I spent much of that night sitting on my porch, listening to the sounds of the night and just replaying the day's events in my head. The forest was alive again, frogs croaking in the creek, an owl hooting in the distance, but none of it brought me any comfort. Something had followed me today, something that wasn't just a passing animal or another person out foraging. Whatever was out there knew me now, and I couldn't help but think it had some kind of an interest in me. Whether that was an innocent curiosity or the perception of a threat, I couldn't be sure, but neither thought was comforting. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moment I saw it. Dark, massive, moving with an express purpose of limiting visibility. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, that I was letting my nerves get the best of me. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a noise, a slow, deliberate knock somewhere outside, not far away. 3 knocks, not the wind, not something I had left out tipping over. Someone or something was out there. I lay frozen, my pulse thundering. For a long moment, there was silence, and I wondered if I had dreamed it. Then it happened again. 3 slow knocks. This time, louder and presumably closer. I grabbed the shotgun from next to my bed and moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer outside. The moon cast pale light over my yard, and at first I saw nothing, just empty space. Then, at the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, something shifted. The movement barely perceptible, but it was there. A dark figure standing there, watching. It wasn't moving, it was just peeking out from behind a tree fixated on my house. I let the curtain fall back into place, my grip tightening around the gun. There was no way I was going outside. Instead, I sat in the chair by the window, staring at the tree line, my body stiff with tension. I stayed that way for hours, watching, listening, barely daring to breathe, but it never came closer. Eventually, as dawn broke, the tension in my chest eased just enough for me to move. I stepped onto the porch, gun still in hand, and scanned the area. Nothing. But when I eventually walked toward the trees, I saw them. Footprints. Huge, deep impressions in the damp earth. They led from the forest edge to within 20 feet of my house, then back again. Whatever had been out there had stood in my yard for a long time before retreating. I spent the day trying to think of any reasonable explanation for what kind of animal this could be. But as I walked the perimeter of my property, I found more unsettling evidence. Near the edge of the woods, a tree had been stripped of its bark. And then there was the smell, a thick, musky odor that hung in the air, clinging to everything. It was like wet fur mixed with decaying leaves, pungent and unfamiliar. The kind of scent that sent a warning through every instinct I had. I didn't go into the woods that day. I told myself I just needed time, that I'd wait until things felt normal again. But as the days passed, I felt more and more apprehensive about going into the woods at all. Some nights, I'd heard movement just outside my property line, branches snapping, something heavy shifting through the brush, always far enough that I couldn't justify grabbing my rifle, but close enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. One night, I heard some kind of a call, deep, resonant, almost like a howl, but not quite. It started low, rising into something eerily close to language. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Then, before I could process what I had heard, another call responded. This one farther off in the distance. There was more than one. Whatever I had seen, whatever had followed me, I wasn't dealing with just one. And whatever they are, they seemed to have some sort of an interest in me. I stopped going into the woods altogether for a long time. Days turned into weeks, then months. Eventually, the sounds at night lessened, and I let myself believe that maybe they had moved on. Maybe they had lost interest in me. Then, one morning, I stepped outside to find something sitting on my porch. A single morel mushroom, placed directly in front of my door. It was fresh, perfectly intact. I stared at it for a long time. I don't know what this means. Are they friendly? Just curious, maybe? Trying to help me for some reason? Or is this supposed to be a threat? Like they know what I was doing in the forest and they don't want me doing it? I honestly don't know. I used to love spending time in the forest, but now I can't help but look over my should the entire